Imagine meeting someone who never raises their voice, never threatens you, never insults you directly. Yet somehow, after every conversation, you feel smaller, less certain, less confident. You start questioning your decisions, second-guessing your instincts, wondering whether you're overreacting. And the strangest part? You can't point to a single moment where they openly attacked you. Because the most effective forms of psychological pressure rarely look like attacks. They look like conversations. And throughout history, some of the most influential people understood a simple truth. If you can shape how someone interprets reality, you can often shape how they behave. That's why today's video isn't about physical power. It's not about authority. It's not even about intelligence. It's about something much more subtle. The hidden psychological forces that slowly erode confidence, distort judgment, and make people easier to influence. More importantly, it's about how to recognize those forces before they begin controlling you. Because once you understand the game, it becomes much harder to play against you. And by the end of this video, you'll see why some people seem almost impossible to manipulate, while others repeatedly fall into the same psychological traps. Let's begin. Most people assume that strong-willed individuals are naturally immune to influence. They imagine mental strength as something you're either born with or you aren't. But reality is far more complicated. Even highly intelligent people can be manipulated. Even successful people can be pressured. Even experienced leaders can be influenced. Why? Because manipulation doesn't begin with intelligence. It begins with human nature. And human nature contains certain vulnerabilities. The desire to belong, the desire to be respected, the desire to avoid rejection, the desire to feel certain. None of these are weaknesses. They're normal human needs. The problem begins when someone learns how to exploit them. Throughout history, rulers, politicians, propagandists, cult leaders, and skilled persuaders have understood a principle that remains true today. People rarely change their minds because of logic alone. They change because emotions alter how they interpret information. And once interpretation changes, behavior often follows. This is why psychological influence is rarely dramatic. It's gradual, subtle, almost invisible. A person's confidence isn't usually destroyed in a single moment. It's weakened over time. One doubt, one insecurity, one hesitation at a time. And that's what makes these tactics dangerous. Not their speed, their patience. Here's something Machiavelli understood exceptionally well. People often focus on obvious threats while ignoring subtle ones. An obvious enemy is easy to identify. A hidden influence is not. If someone openly insults you, your defenses activate immediately. You recognize the threat. You evaluate it. You respond. But what happens when the threat arrives disguised as concern, disguised as advice, disguised as friendship? Now things become more complicated. Because your defenses may never activate at all. This is why some of the most powerful forms of influence operate beneath awareness. Not because they're magical, because they're difficult to notice. Imagine someone constantly questioning your decisions. Not aggressively, just enough. Not enough to start an argument, just enough to create uncertainty. At first, nothing seems unusual. But after weeks or months, a pattern begins emerging. You become less confident in your judgment. You seek more reassurance. You hesitate more often. What changed? Not your intelligence, not your ability, your certainty. And certainty plays a bigger role in human behavior than most people realize. People who trust their judgment behave differently from people who constantly doubt it. That's why confidence matters. Not because confidence guarantees correctness, because confidence influences action. Without it, even capable individuals become hesitant, and hesitation creates vulnerability. Now here's where things get interesting. Many people assume manipulation works because manipulators are extraordinarily clever. But that's not usually true. The most effective influence often succeeds because human beings are predictable. We all possess emotional patterns. We all have insecurities. We all have fears. We all have blind spots. And when those blind spots remain invisible to us, they become entry points for influence. Think about criticism. Why can one criticism roll off your back while another stays in your mind for years? The answer reveals something important. The most powerful criticisms aren't necessarily the harshest ones. They're the ones that connect to existing insecurity. If someone criticizes something you're completely comfortable with, the impact is often minimal. But if they touch a hidden doubt, the effect can be enormous. Suddenly the criticism feels significant, not because the words were powerful, because they landed in fertile ground. This is one reason self-awareness is so important. The more honestly you understand yourself, the fewer hidden vulnerabilities exist. And the fewer hidden vulnerabilities exist, the harder you become to influence through them. But most people avoid self-examination. Why? Because it's uncomfortable. It's much easier to analyze others than ourselves. Much easier to identify someone else's weaknesses than our own. Yet this avoidance creates risk, because whatever remains unconscious can quietly influence behavior. And influence that operates beneath awareness is often the most powerful kind. Let's talk about another factor that frequently appears in psychological pressure: isolation. Not necessarily physical isolation. Psychological isolation. This happens when a person gradually becomes disconnected from alternative perspectives. The fewer viewpoints someone encounters, the easier it becomes for a single viewpoint to dominate. This principle appears everywhere. In politics, in organizations, in relationships, in social groups, and even in online communities. When people only hear one interpretation of reality, that interpretation often begins feeling like reality itself. This doesn't happen because people are foolish. It happens because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates comfort. The human brain naturally prefers certainty over uncertainty. We like clear answers, clear identities, clear narratives. The problem is that reality is often messy, complicated, ambiguous, and anyone offering simple answers to complex questions immediately becomes attractive. Not because they're correct, because certainty feels good. This is one reason manipulative figures often sound extremely confident. Confidence creates credibility, at least initially. People instinctively assume certainty indicates knowledge. But those aren't the same thing. A person can be extremely certain and completely wrong. History provides endless examples. That's why critical thinking requires something difficult: the ability to separate confidence from competence. And that ability becomes increasingly valuable in a world overflowing with persuasive voices. Now here's a question. Why do some people remain psychologically independent even under pressure? Why do certain individuals seem resistant to influence that affects everyone else? The answer isn't that they're emotionless. It's not that they never experience doubt. It's not that they're immune to persuasion. The difference is that they maintain ownership over their thinking. They evaluate information carefully. They tolerate uncertainty. They resist the urge for immediate answers. And most importantly, they don't outsource their identity. This last point is crucial, because many forms of manipulation become effective only when people depend on external validation. Think about how often human beings seek approval. Approval from friends, approval from family, approval from colleagues, approval from strangers. Again, this is normal. Everyone enjoys acceptance. The danger appears when approval becomes necessary rather than appreciated. Because necessity creates leverage. The more desperately someone needs approval, the easier approval becomes to control. And once approval becomes a tool, influence becomes easier. This is why genuine self-respect matters. Not arrogance, not superiority. Self-respect. The ability to maintain a stable sense of worth independent of constant external confirmation. People who possess this quality are difficult to pressure. Not impossible, just difficult, because their decisions aren't entirely dependent on how others respond. They can tolerate disagreement. They can tolerate criticism. They can tolerate temporary rejection. And those abilities dramatically reduce vulnerability to manipulation. Here's something that surprises many people. The strongest defense against psychological pressure is often not aggression. It's awareness. Aggression can be provoked. Awareness is harder to exploit. When you understand what you're feeling, why you're feeling it, and what might be influencing that feeling, your options increase. You gain distance. You create space between stimulus and response. And within that space lies freedom. The freedom to choose. The freedom to evaluate. The freedom to think before reacting. Most manipulation depends on reducing that space, creating urgency, creating emotional intensity, creating pressure, because pressure encourages impulsive decisions. And impulsive decisions are easier to influence than deliberate ones. This is why emotional regulation remains one of the most underrated skills a person can develop. Not because emotions are bad. Emotions provide valuable information. The problem arises when emotions become unquestioned instructions. When every feeling becomes a command. Every fear becomes reality. Every doubt becomes truth. At that point, external influences gain enormous power. Because they no longer need to control your actions directly. They only need to influence your emotions. And your emotions will do the rest. In a moment, we're going to uncover the specific psychological patterns that repeatedly appear in coercive influence, why strong men often fall for them without realizing it, and the surprising reason that the people most confident in their immunity are sometimes the easiest to influence. Because the greatest psychological trap isn't believing you're weak. It's believing you're impossible to deceive. Let's start with a paradox. The people most vulnerable to manipulation are often not the weakest. They're often the most certain, the most convinced, the most confident that they could never be influenced. At first, that sounds absurd. After all, wouldn't confidence protect you? Sometimes. But overconfidence creates a different danger. It closes the door to self-examination. The moment someone believes they're immune to influence, they stop checking for it. And when awareness disappears, vulnerability grows. History is filled with intelligent individuals who believe they were too smart to be manipulated. Yet intelligence alone offers surprisingly little protection. Why? Because manipulation rarely targets intelligence directly. It targets emotion, identity, fear, belonging, status, and every human being possesses those things, no matter how intelligent they are. This is why influence often succeeds gradually rather than dramatically. It doesn't force a person into a completely new worldview overnight. Instead, it nudges, a little at a time, one assumption, one emotional reaction, one interpretation, one compromise. And because each step feels small, the overall change often goes unnoticed. Think about walking down a long road. If someone moved you 3 feet to the left, you might not notice immediately. But after several miles, you'd end up somewhere entirely different. Psychological influence frequently operates the same way. Small shifts, repeated consistently, producing outcomes that seem impossible when viewed from the beginning. This is why awareness must be continuous rather than occasional. You don't protect your judgment once. You protect it repeatedly. Every day, every conversation, every important decision. Because the forces attempting to shape your thinking never truly disappear. They simply change forms. Now here's something worth paying attention to. Many people assume manipulation begins with pressure, but often it begins with comfort. Think about that. People become cautious around obvious threats. They become relaxed around familiarity. and familiarity lowers defenses. This is one reason trust is such a powerful force. Trust allows information to travel further. Trust allows influence to travel further. Trust allows ideas to bypass skepticism. Again, trust itself isn't bad. Human relationships depend on it. The danger appears when trust replaces critical thinking. When a person stops evaluating information because of who delivered it. Instead of asking whether something is true, they ask whether they like the source. And those are very different questions. One leads toward understanding. The other can lead toward dependency. This explains why charismatic individuals often have tremendous influence. People don't merely listen to them. They identify with them. And identification is powerful. Because once a person's identity becomes attached to an idea, changing that idea becomes emotionally difficult. Suddenly, disagreement feels personal. Contradictory evidence feels threatening. Alternative viewpoints feel uncomfortable. Not because they're wrong, because they challenge belonging. And human beings have always feared exclusion. For thousands of years, belonging increased survival. Isolation increased risk. Our psychology still reflects those ancient realities, which means social pressure often affects people far more than they realize. Even strong people, even independent people, even people who consider themselves free thinkers. The desire to belong remains one of the strongest forces in human behavior, and anyone who understands that possesses a significant advantage. Here's where Stoicism offers a useful perspective. The Stoics repeatedly emphasize something most people overlook. External events are not entirely within your control. Your interpretations are. At first glance, this sounds simple, but its implications are enormous. Because manipulation often begins by influencing interpretation, the event itself remains unchanged. Only the meaning attached to it changes. Imagine two people receiving criticism. One interprets it as useful feedback. The other interprets it as humiliation. The criticism is identical. The emotional outcome is completely different. Why? Interpretation. And interpretation determines behavior. This insight remains extraordinarily relevant today, because modern life constantly presents competing interpretations. News, social media, advertising, politics, entertainment. Everywhere you look, people are attempting to shape how events are understood, not necessarily through deception, but through framing. Framing determines emphasis. Framing determines attention. Framing determines emotional response. An emotional response often determines action. This is why mentally strong individuals develop the habit of stepping back. They create distance between information and conclusion, distance between emotion and reaction, distance between pressure and decision. That distance is invaluable, because influence thrives on immediacy. Awareness thrives on reflection. Now let's talk about another pattern that appears repeatedly: the manipulation of urgency. Few things impair judgment faster than artificial urgency. Decide now. Act immediately. Don't think too much. Everyone else already agrees. The details change. The structure remains the same. Urgency compresses time, and compressed time often reduces critical thinking. When people feel rushed, they rely more heavily on emotion, instinct, and social cues. That's not a character flaw. It's human psychology, which is exactly why urgency appears so frequently in persuasion. The solution isn't moving slowly forever. The solution is recognizing when urgency serves reality and when urgency serves influence. Some decisions genuinely require speed. Many do not. Learning the difference can prevent enormous mistakes. Now here's a question. What makes someone truly difficult to manipulate? Most people answer confidence. Others answer intelligence. Some answer experience. All helpful qualities, but none represent the deepest answer. The deepest answer is internal stability. A stable person can hear criticism without collapsing, hear praise without becoming dependent, hear disagreement without becoming defensive, hear approval without becoming addicted. This stability creates resilience, and resilience creates freedom, because external influences lose power when internal stability increases. Think about a tree during a storm. A rigid tree may appear strong, but excessive rigidity often leads to breaking. A flexible tree bends, adapts, survives. Mental resilience functions similarly. It isn't stubbornness. It isn't inflexibility. It's the ability to remain grounded while adapting to reality. And that ability becomes increasingly important in a world filled with competing attempts to capture attention. Which brings us to attention itself. Attention might be the most valuable resource people routinely give away. Every day, countless forces compete for it. Algorithms, advertisers, commentators, influencers, organizations, friends, strangers. Everyone wants a piece of your attention. Because attention influences thought. Thought influences behavior. Behavior influences outcomes. The chain is remarkably simple. Control attention long enough, and you can often influence what people believe is important. That's why protecting attention matters. Not through isolation, through intentionality. Choosing where attention goes rather than allowing every distraction to decide for you. Many people spend years developing skills while neglecting this one. Yet the ability to direct attention may influence every other skill they possess. Because without attention, development becomes difficult. Without attention, reflection becomes difficult. Without attention, growth becomes difficult. This is one reason psychological pressure frequently attempts to create distraction. A distracted mind becomes reactive. A focused mind becomes selective. And selectivity is a form of power. Now let's revisit Machiavelli. One reason his writings continue generating discussion centuries later is that he observed human nature realistically rather than ideally. People often prefer comforting beliefs, but reality doesn't always cooperate. People are influenced by incentives, by status, by fear, by perception. Ignoring those forces doesn't eliminate them. Understanding them creates options. And options matter, because people without options become easier to influence. This principle applies everywhere. Financially, socially, professionally, psychologically. The more alternatives available to a person, the more independent that person becomes. The fewer alternatives available, the more pressure increases. This is why genuine strength often involves creating options before they're needed, building skills before crisis arrives, building confidence before challenge arrives, building self-respect before criticism arrives. Preparation creates freedom, and freedom reduces vulnerability. Here's a pattern interrupt. Imagine two men entering a negotiation. The first desperately needs the outcome. The second wants the outcome but can walk away. Who possesses more leverage? Most people immediately understand the answer. The second man, not because he's smarter, because he has options. Psychological independence functions the same way. The less desperately you need approval, the harder approval becomes to weaponize. The less desperately you need validation, the harder validation becomes to control. The less desperately you need agreement, the harder disagreement becomes to threaten you. Need creates vulnerability. Freedom reduces it. This doesn't mean becoming detached from humanity. It means avoiding dependency. And dependency is one of the recurring themes hidden beneath many forms of manipulation. Now we arrive at perhaps the most important lesson in this entire discussion. The goal is not becoming impossible to influence. That's unrealistic. Every human being is influenced by something. The goal is becoming consciously influenceable rather than unconsciously influenceable. There's a profound difference. Conscious influence involves evaluation, choice, awareness. Unconscious influence bypasses those processes. And that's where problems emerge. Because what remains unconscious often operates unchecked. This is why self-awareness remains one of the most practical forms of protection available. Not paranoia, not cynicism, awareness. The ability to observe your thoughts, question assumptions, examine emotional reactions, recognize patterns. Awareness doesn't eliminate vulnerability. It illuminates it. And once illuminated, vulnerability becomes easier to manage. Here's something many people discover too late. The greatest threats to freedom are not always external. Sometimes they're internal. Impulsiveness, insecurity, need for validation, fear of rejection, fear of uncertainty, fear of criticism. These forces can influence behavior just as effectively as external pressure, sometimes more effectively, which means the battle for independence often begins within. Not because the world doesn't matter, because perception shapes how the world is experienced, and perception influences every decision that follows. So let's return to the question we asked at the beginning. How do people attempt to break another person's will? Not through magic, not through secret techniques. Most often, through pressure placed upon ordinary human vulnerabilities. Fear, doubt, isolation, dependency, urgency, status, belonging, the same psychological forces that have influenced human behavior for centuries. Understanding those forces doesn't make you cynical. It makes you aware, and awareness changes everything. Because once you begin recognizing these patterns, they become harder to hide. You start noticing attempts to create unnecessary urgency,